inflation, which is what I want to touch on first. If you ask pretty much any American right now what their top issue is, it's most likely going to be inflation. Inflation over the last, almost 3 years at this point has been running rampant at about 8% on average, which is the worst it's been in a while. Just to give you a little bit of context of where we're at with inflation. So Trump never went above 3% inflation in his presidency, which is an important contrast to put to Biden and his economic policy, which is kind of what we're going to talk about for the most of this episode. 3 months after Biden took office is when inflation really started to ramp up, where we went from 4.2% to about 10%. And then right now we're at about 4%, ramping back down. Just to give everyone a little bit of history, a little bit of context behind inflation. Inflation has been, well, I actually want to start with this. I want to start with, so in the simplest terms possible, we talk about inflation a lot, but what is inflation? Inflation in the most simple terms is essentially when demand outruns the supply. So right now we're in a very consumer economy where the demand is very high, but the supply is very low. That supply is starting to catch up. And a lot of that supply, the reason why it was low was because of global supply chain issues, which are starting to kind of get, those wrinkles are starting to get out of our global supply chain. And a lot of it is also caused by government spending, which we'll talk about in a second. Just going through history, we tend to see towards the end of large wars, inflation tends to go pretty high. We saw in 1917 through 20, we had inflation up past 15%, average maybe of 18%. And then we also had what is called deflation, which is kind of the opposite of what I described. Deflation is when supply outruns the demand. So we have just a ton of products, lots of supply, but the demand is very low. And there's a lot of reasons for that supply. Deflation is a lot more uncommon than inflation. We saw it. So oftentimes we'll see deflation right after a ton of inflation. And there's a lot of different economic theories for why that is. But one of the greatest is just simply that people were trying to essentially discourage spending so much that the pendulum swung the other way, which is a tool that the Federal Reserve uses in order to decrease inflation. So using the example of like the late 1910s, at the beginning in the 20s, we saw deflation where you were seeing 10%, 12%, even at one point we had 14.9% deflation, which is also really bad. Obviously, there are really famous examples of bad inflation, like the late 70s and 80s. We had bad inflation for about half that decade. And so inflation is not necessarily a unique thing to our time, but it kind of was irrelevant since the 70s. We saw like a little bit of inflation in the late 80s, early 90s. It only ever got up to like 5% inflation. But since then, since really the 70s, we haven't seen a lot of bad inflation. You probably heard the statistics that it's the worst inflation we've had in 40 years. That is kind of where that comes from. We had really bad inflation because of kind of the Jimmy Carter era until today, where we see that inflation basically became bad as soon as COVID hit. Well, that is debatable. Inflation didn't hit until about a year after COVID, but a lot of what we did during COVID, such as a lot of the social welfare, the COVID packages that went out, kind of spurred on that inflation. So we saw in about 2021 and about April of 2021, so about 1 year after COVID started, was when we hit that 4.2% inflation, and then it skyrocketed all the way up to, according to usinflationcalculator.com, it went up to about 9.1%, but a lot of people estimate that it was at more like 10.5%, which is pretty bad. And now everyone kind of agrees we're sitting between about 4.5% inflation and 4% inflation, which is a lot better than before. I want to talk about the partner for this podcast today. Ground News is the all-world media in one place service. That's right. Ground News is a website and app that gathers news from a staggering 50,000 sources worldwide. What sets Ground News apart is its ability to show you how breaking news is being covered across the political spectrum. It's like having a front row seat to the diverse perspectives of the world. With Ground News, you can easily compare coverage from various outlets and get a complete picture of the story. But wait, there is more. Ground News goes beyond the surface through data driven analysis. It provides you with insights into the political bias, reliability, and ownership of news outlets. With my link down in the description below, you will get 15% off from Ground News. Right now, subscriptions run from literally like $1 a month. This is something that you guys need. I use it for a lot of my videos because not only is it important to know what happened, it's important to know who reported on it and why. My favorite feature of Ground News is it tells you who owns the news source, so that you can see if there's a certain thing on maybe green energy, for instance, is that newspaper owned by George Soros? So you can see the political biases behind it. Again, go to my link down below. You'll get 15% off. It is a great service. The Federal Reserve kind of estimates that about 2% inflation a year is a healthy inflation. So just to be clear, I know a lot of numbers are thrown out on news channels. For those of you who aren't aware, when those numbers are thrown out, what they're talking about is if this inflation persisted, what would it be on the year? And that's the number. So when you hear 4% inflation, it's not saying that inflation is going to go up 4% in that month. It's simply that for this month, if this persisted throughout the year, the dollar would be inflated by 4%. So at no time have we been going up 10% per month, but year on year, it's worked out to about 10% for some months. When it comes, the reason why I'm talking about this is not to necessarily put a judgment on any one person. I think that's a conversation for another day, and I'm happy to talk about the bad things that Donald Trump did, as well as Joe Biden, in order to create inflation. And there's no doubt in my mind, there's some debate among economists, but very little, that government spending really creates bad inflation. And I'm quite certain that that is the case here. Global supply chain also has a massive thing to do with it, which I think is still on the executive branch as well as the legislative branch. But I think that it's important to sometimes we, as voters, as Americans, get caught up in the numbers too much, which is ironic because I just brought up the numbers. The numbers are important. I think it's good for everyone to be educated, to understand the facts. But sometimes we get tunnel visioned. We get tunnel visioned into our parties that we really like, our certain politicians that are very charismatic, even some politicians that maybe aren't as charismatic, but for whatever reason we have a personal connection or ethos to them. It's important to step back for a second, and I think this will be huge going into the 2024 election, and think to ourselves, how do I feel? Like, how is my life? Like, what is the quality of my life? I'm not saying this is always the right metric to use when trying to measure how good a president is or how effective the government's being, but sometimes we get it in our heads that, like, despite the difficulties, we still like the politician that's leading us. And it's like, no, 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 no. Take a step back for a second and think to yourself, how is my life right now? And what are the things that are not good in my life? And then obviously there's going to be a lot of things that are self-inflicted or outside of the government's control. And I've always said that you're not going to want to wait on the government to change your life. You're going to have to take control for yourself. But when it comes to the economy, for instance, like, we can't control the economy. We're just individuals. This is a macro economy, not a micro economy. And so we're thinking, is my life good right now? Is it better than, say, 5 years ago? And who do I want leading based on that? And I think if you sat down with any American, and we don't need to talk politicians, we don't even need to talk politics, you just ask them, how are you doing right now? Like, do you feel like you're thriving, or do you feel like you're struggling? And if they say, I'm struggling, which most Americans will right now because of inflation, as well as other variables that we'll talk about in a second, if you ask them that, they're going to say, I'm struggling. And then you just need to ask them, do you think that it has to do with the leadership that is in place right now? If they say no, then you need to ask them why then. If they say yes, then you need to ask them, well, maybe consider voting for someone else, maybe someone who you can connect a good time in your life to. because I can say personally, right now is a little different for me. I'm a young adult. I'm going into a new phase of life where finances are much more important to me. But even as a teenager under the Trump administration, I was fairly self-sufficient. I was, making money and paying bills, and it was a lot easier under Trump. I mean, just going to the gas pump and seeing 199 as opposed to 399, that's just a difference. And again, I'm not saying everything is on the president, but I just think as a matter of voting, this is a smart, persuasive tactic for conservatives at this point to go to their more independent and open minded friends and just ask them those simple questions. Are you better off right now than you were in 2017? Because if you're not, then maybe consider voting the other way.